When I ask, what do I do to create the kind of performance I need in others to get the outcomes I want? One of the things I need to do is kind of create the conditions or organizational climate. You know, when we think of conditions, sometimes we talk about time and tools and resources and equipment, but I want to approach this a little bit broader. In order to do that, I want you to go back and take a look at page 13, the leadership chain. If you don't feel like flipping back, it's on this slide here. But when we're talking about conditions, I'm really talking about that green box here, the type of work environment that we create. Sometimes conditions, we use the word environment here. And again, the environment is shaped by our leadership behaviors, which are formed by our commitment to our values, and again, the skills that we bring that we're learning in this workshop. So we want to create that great positive working climate. And one of the ways we see what's going on within a business unit or a facility is through what we call the Employee Opinion Survey. How many of you are familiar with the Emerson Employee Opinion Survey? Okay, maybe a show of hands, how many of you aren't? Okay, so welcome to Emerson. This was actually one of my most pleasant surprises about Emerson. So just a recap for the rest of you, new information for you. This Employee Opinion Survey, let's begin on page 113. Is actually a survey that we conducted every Emerson facility that has 50 or more employees about once every 3 years, about once every 36 months. And in the survey, we ask a number of questions related to different areas like benefits, comp, about their division, about what they think about management at that facility, what they think about their supervisor, what they think about their job, how they feel about the amount of communications, and their reaction, their impressions of human resources at that facility. These surveys are offered to both hourly employees and salaried employees. Just a couple of things here. The surveys have been updated. You'll notice on the middle of page 113. We've now included some new questions. We've now included 5 more questions about safety and 1 written question or comment, because safety is one of our values. We asked 2 questions to gauge the employee's understanding about our ethics policies. And then we have 2 questions to measure the employee's perception of diversity and inclusion. So these questions have just begun to recently appear, like over the last 6 or 7 months. So what happens with these surveys, again, they highlight things, but remember we said surveys don't often explain it. So after the surveys, the data is analyzed, and then focus groups usually take place, and they use interviews to kind of get under the hood, to get underneath the cloud to see what's really happening. The surveys highlight it, the interviews now begin to explain it. And if there's some discrepancies or areas of underperformance, detailed action plans come up. And then from that time that the action plan is created up until the next time of the survey, a fairly rigorous measurement process is in place to see what has the local management and supervision done to improve these scores. So that said, let's go to the back of the book in the reference tab, and I want to show you an example of an employee opinion survey. This is on page 145 in your reference tab. This is an example of an actual employee opinion survey summary. I see these. I get every one from every facility around the world, so I'm looking at these all the time. You can see up here in the CC section who this goes to. The first person on the distribution list is our CEO. I know that he sees these because many times I'll see these and I'll see his handwriting all over that because it's sent to me as a PDF. So he pays very, very close attention to these, especially if they're underperforming. But I also see his handwriting on these to give positive, supportive feedback when a facility is performing well. So you see who's on the distribution list here. In the middle, you'll see that at this particular place, they've had at least 3 series of surveys, about 3 years apart. And you can see in this particular one, there's an upward trend. You've got the scores from the salaried employees and scores from the hourly employees, and you can see between over the years here that the scores have gone up. from 2011 to 2016, those are good scores. This is actually a real survey. We also measure the participation rate. And then there's an executive summary at the bottom, which kind of gives you the high-level view of what's happened. And then on the next page, I like this, there's a timeline. You might think back to those questions you asked, have there been any changes in the workplace recently? Sometimes by identifying some changes that happen to that facility, it might begin to help explain why survey scores might have gone up or why they might have gone down. So I like this timeline. The heart and the value of this survey is action plans. These are not navel-gazing exercises. There's actually detailed action plans with commitments and who does what by when, and these are carefully tracked by our corporate employee relations team. I'll often use these personally because I see every one of these to highlight, are there any areas of underperformance that might be due to a lack of knowledge and skill? In so doing, I might be able to identify potential training solutions or how to get resources over there to skill up. But again, not every underperforming survey is due to a lack of knowledge and skill. That means we put in training. So survey scores are tracked very carefully. And if they go down, we want to know why they went down and have an explanation behind it. This is a really positive thing in the sense that it forces management to get connected with employees. Let me just give you a couple of things here. It's not in your book, but a couple things related to the survey scores. Anything that appears on the survey that's higher than 30% unfavorable is considered an issue, except compensation and benefits. Now, there's a reason why. Is because we know after running this for 62 consecutive years that people will always say something about compensation and benefits. So statistically, they're comfortable with that. If comp and benefits is 50% or higher, then it is an issue, and then they dig in, they begin to do some research and market comparisons and things like that. This third bullet is interesting. Management scores are carefully compared to supervisor scores in each work area to identify supervisors who may be deflecting responsibility. Here's what that means. An individual contributor's just been promoted to a supervisor and they're managing their peers. What's hard for them is to make the break and realize that they speak for management now. And sometimes they don't want to because, these are my peers, right? And so they might be deflecting when a management decision has to come through. They might say, well, those people in the corner office, you can't do anything about that. And we're able to actually identify supervisors who are deflecting their responsibility. They're paid to represent the management at this point. Interesting, and I think I mentioned this when we talked about employee engagement. One of the reasons why the survey was initially created in the early 1950s was to identify potential union organization at some of our production facilities. And the idea was that if employees felt good about the place they were going into, there wouldn't be a need for organization. So again, I like this. It's not a search for the guilty and a punishment for the many. This really causes us to look at ourselves and get the employee's opinion of what they think about us. In fact, let's take a look at some of the survey questions here. If you've not seen this before, I guess you're the only one who hasn't. On pages 114 and 115 are a sample of the new updated survey questions that are sent to salaried employees. And then on the next two pages, the updated questions that are asked of hourly employees. They're mostly similar, but there are a couple differences. But here's what I want you to do. If you're looking through either one of these, the salaried or the hourly, take a look at how many questions are the employees asked about their perception of management at that facility. How many questions are asked about us? Take a minute and discuss that at your table. I was actually able to use these employee opinion surveys to make a business case for a specific learning center workshop. One of the things I noticed that when I came in is we really didn't have a workshop that helped people transition into new leadership roles. And I've become quite a fan of the book called The First 90 Days. Have any of you ever read this book? So Michael Watkins, who was at Harvard, wrote this best-selling book called The First 90 Days. And I began to make a business case for why we should do that, because traditionally the way that we transition people here into new leadership roles was, you probably heard it, goodbye, good luck, and don't screw up. And I began to run the traps with our corporate employee relations team, and we were able to correlate that 22% of all failed employee opinion surveys could be directly correlated to a failed leader transition at that location during the survey period. So it's very easy for me to make a compelling business case for why we should support transitions and have skill-specific training and workshops and tools for that. So I'm using this as a tool to help the business as well. So let's put this into perspective and make it real for what you and I do and why we're here today. I want to paint a scenario for you. Here's a case study. You're in an Emerson facility that just went through your employee opinion survey. You're another facility, you're a different facility, you're another Emerson facility. You just had your employee opinion surveys. You rocked it. Congratulations and thank you. Your hourly scores are higher than ever. Your salaried scores are better than ever. How did you do it? As a group of supervisors and managers and leaders at that facility, I want you to write down what you did to get such great survey scores over the last survey period. Go ahead, using an action, verb, and a noun, write those things down on your flip chart. Leave things out like comp and benefits because we really can't do much about that, but just think in your role as a supervisor or a manager and a leader, what are the things that you did to get the salaried employees and hourly employees to rate you higher than ever? Put it on your flip chart, and by the way, if you could correlate specific page numbers from your Leading at Emerson toolkit, I will give you extra credit. So when you ask that question, what must I do to create the kind of performance I need in my employees to get the outcomes I want? This is your job inventory. I see a list of action, verbs, and nouns here, and right next to them, I see job aids and page numbers that are going to help you do this. So again, we've given you a process to follow and some tools to use. Make sense? If your list weren't enough, page 118 is a very important page for all of us. How to create a positive work environment. Nothing is left to the imagination here, gang, so take a look at page 118. Here's a list of other things beyond that. So if you ever go back and look at this leadership chain back on page 13, and you're kind of questioning, how do I get this green thing to work? Just pull out page 118, and you'll know what to do. Again, these things require more intentionality than skill, but we've given you the skill, you bring the will, right? Okay. Let me just introduce one thing that we'll be doing, but when we come back from lunch, another thing that affects the work environment is our ability to lead with integrity, and I was really pleased to see a good half dozen check marks on that one, objective number 9, leading with integrity. Let's just introduce it on page 119. I remember I joined a company, I was there about 4 months. The president of our North American business was moving on. They announced a new president of the North American business. He was responsible for about 8,500 employees. Called a town hall meeting in our main global headquarters there, where we were located, and it was kind of like a shopping mall. There were balconies, and there were like people spilling over the balconies in this town hall meeting. The rest of us were crowded on the main floor of the atrium. There was a raised platform and a podium and a microphone, and the newly announced president is announced. We all politely clap. He walks up to the podium, adjusts the microphone. Of course, you get that awful feedback squeal, right? You just kind of expect that. He clears his throat into the microphone. First words out of his mouth are, "I am a man of integrity." What do you think was the bubble caption above most people's heads?
Why do you have to tell me?
No, you're not. Why was that your bubble caption?
If you were, you wouldn't have to tell me.
Yeah. Integrity is what other people say about you. And if you have to proclaim it about yourself, there's probably an integrity issue, isn't there? And sure enough, there was. So, integrity is the title that you earn, that other people grant to you just like influence. It's not something that you can proclaim. So let's wrap up our morning by looking at this page 119. When we were engineering leading at Emerson, we knew that we wanted a module on integrity, and we weren't going to be talking about ethics because we already had ethics training. But as we got further along in the development, it became clear to me that at Emerson, we were using the word ethics and integrity interchangeably, just kind of like managing and leading. And I began to raise the concern about this because people were saying, yeah, we got to talk about ethics, we got to talk about ethics. And we said, we had the agreement that we were going to talk about integrity. They said, well, they're the same thing. And I said, well, actually, they're not. Because in our leadership competency model at the time, we had one competency that said integrity and trust. The other one was ethics and values, so they were seen as different competencies. And so that caused confusion. And so we went back to some definitions. They're here on page 119. Ethics is the adherence to a standard of a prescribed code of conduct. That's ethics, is how we adhere to some kind of code of conduct that's stated by our employer. But integrity is our commitment to adhere to those. And it was interesting because at the time we were doing this, I was actually reporting, my boss was the chief ethics officer. And he said, I'm still frustrated. I see them as being the same thing. Terrence, what's the difference between ethics and integrity? I said, Mike, over your years in your career, have you ever worked for somebody who played by the rules but you didn't trust them? There's the difference. You can work for somebody who plays by the rules, but if you don't trust them, they might be acting in an ethical manner, but you're sensing that they're lacking integrity. Now, what makes integrity a little bit more different than the other skills here is you can't do a job study. You can't say, what's subtask 1 and step 1 and so on. It's kind of a summary of things. Let's take a look at it real quick on page 120. Let's start off with a quick self-assessment. This is for your eyes only. A little bit different than maybe the other assessments, like how well do I listen, or how well do I delegate, or how well do I know them, evolve them, and grow them. Let me ask you this. If you pass this survey off to somebody else to have anonymously completed, well, what they checked off in yours, would they look the same? I don't know what you want to do with this page, but you might find it to be very, very helpful to refer to from time to time as you're kind of doing some self-assessing here, and maybe there's risks and rewards of passing this off to other people, because you know what? When you check yes or no to these things, go back to these 4 sources of influence on there. When we talked about developing and eroding, here you go. It's just right there. And our ability to lead in an ethical manner might determine whether we're going to have commitment or compliance, okay? And here we have to be compliant to the ethics, but we also need to be committed to it. That said, let's break for lunch. Your lunch tickets are right there. We'll see you back in 1 hour. And as soon as we come back, we're going to launch into a case study for Emerson-specific scenarios. Integrity, a little different than some of the other skills. This is not, you can't do a job study, right? You can't do step 1, step 2, step 3. However, we can look at some considerations. Lead with integrity considerations. Could you pull out your highlighter? There might be some things that jump out to you on page 121. It might all speak to you somewhat differently, but at the same way, you want to lead with integrity. Here's kind of the filter we need to run it through. How could these questions help you help others? Because sometimes people come to you for advice or coaching or counsel and they go, I want to make the right decision, but I'm not sure what. What will this page do to help you help them? Yeah, this is part of the coaching conversations, and sometimes you don't want to tell them what the right thing to do is, unless it's clearly a violation, but the questions might help them conclude it themselves. Let's actually practice this right now. We've got 4 more Emerson-specific case studies on the next page. You look at situation 1, situation 2, number 3, and situation 4, please. What I want you to do is read your case study, and then there's 3 questions on the top of page 122 that you need to report back to. After you read the case study, run them through the filter of those 7 questions on the previous page, and then try to come up to a consensus as to what needs to be done here. What's the integrity issue? What's the potential short-term and long-term consequences? What do we need to do to lead with integrity? This is going to take you 10 minutes. Can somebody read your scenario to us, page 122, we'll read along, and then answer the 3 questions for us on the top of that page. Yeah, is my decision based on expediency versus integrity? You know, what was interesting about this case study is when we first had it, we took the word immediately out of the second sentence originally. We said another employee was terminated. And what we found is people in the class were beginning to negotiate, oh yeah, well, we'll terminate them. But wait a minute, they did something that warrants termination. Well, I know, but we got to hit our numbers this quarter. Well, there's a line. I can tell you because I ran these past the chief ethics officer. He, in no uncertain terms, told me to tell you they are fired immediately, regardless of the revenue, whether it comes in or not. They're fired. So that's what we have to do. You make the decisions, and somehow they make you back. But if you want to make the right call and lead with integrity and get people's commitment, and make sure that you're developing your sources of influence, these are important pages. These are important questions. One last section on in conditions, page 124. I told you we'd get back to this, one of the job aids of turning a hidden bias into a visible one. It fits well here. We talked about retrain your brain. We talked about turn a hidden bias into a visible one. So here it is. There's some options here. Many of these were actually described in your online learning module, so you can always go back to that. We talked about building and developing relationships with people who aren't like ourselves. But I like these questions at the bottom. You know, if you're a manager, ask yourself these questions. Do I tend to hire people who are just like me? You know, how do I go about identifying my future successor candidates for promotion? So again, a good way to wrap up this section on conditions, again, because that's the organizational climate. We want a healthy, high-performing organization, so these are important things for us to do too. Here's what I'd like you to do. Go to your implementation plan on page 131. I think we all realize too, our performance has a ripple effect on the performance of our team, so it's important that our performance always be the best, and that's why you're here over these 3 days. There's an old Italian expression that says, the shoemaker is always the worst shod. Shoemaker is so busy taking care of everybody's needs that his own needs are often overlooked. Isn't that the case with you and I too sometimes? We're so busy taking care of business and taking care of other people's needs, to know them, evolve them, and grow them, that sometimes our own needs are often overlooked. So in this section, we're really going to talk about how to put good shoes on ourselves so that we can run this job very, very well. Page 125. The way that we'll approach this is what we call, at Emerson, the 70-20-10 development framework. And I described this briefly in my intro, but we'll deep dive it now. What this model says is that the majority of how you and I develop is primarily experiential in nature at work. 70% of it happens through targeted developmental assignments. It means learning by doing. Part of that happens when your boss delegates some of her or his tasks to you because they're delegating for development. For some of you, at some point, it might mean taking an expat assignment. It might mean crossing business units. For some people, it means crossing business platforms. But development is a long-term focus. 20% of how you and I develop happens through our networks and our relationships. It happens through mentoring or coaching relationships or peer groups. Sometimes is by being a part of a professional association. 10% of your development happens through something like this, focus training. I had an interesting conversation with John Ramon a few weeks ago about this 70-20-10. Because a lot of times, like when I facilitate talent reviews, the business units will often call me the 10% guy. Oh, you're the 10% guy. But I was having a great conversation with John, and I said, the purpose of this 10% is to activate the 70 and the 20. That's why we do it. I think historically, up until a couple years ago, training was also always kind of seen as some isolated thing that you did. Oh, it's been a few years since I went to training. I should go and let's check the box. I used to refer to it as an isolated learning consumable. It was done in complete isolation to the rest of your development plan. So I want you to write this down somewhere because this is going to be important for you because you develop your direct reports too. The purpose of this 10% is to activate the 70 and the 20. So part of that means taking training, making sure you get the training, make sure that your direct reports get the training. But again, we talked about the implementation phase of learning. You remember, we've got 12 weeks between now and our capstone call. Gang, that's the 70 and 20 part. Our 3 days here is the 10%. Your next 12 weeks is at 70 and 20. It's when we put it to work, back at work. I want to spend some time talking a little bit more about the 70-20-10 model. Page 126 is another way that you might develop. That's through taking a 360 feedback assessment. How many of you have ever undergone a 360 survey yourself? Okay, so a good number of you here. And this is other people's perception, a snapshot in time, their perception of how you see you performing your role. So if you're not familiar with the 360, it's a multi-rater survey that you select respondents who are your direct reports, some who are your peers, your boss or your bosses, and maybe some other people. And they're going to give their perception to how they see you at that moment in time. And it highlights some opportunities. It also might highlight some problems. So on page 126, we just have a brief description. This is new. This wasn't in last month's edition of Leading at Emerson, but we have just a brief descriptor of what the 360 does and how you might want to go about coordinating those things. But based on your 360, you might identify some areas in the 70% you'll work on. Sometimes people come to the workshops because of their 360 have called out some specific knowledge and skill gaps that the focus training can help them with. Again, Socrates said the non-examined life is not worth living, and I think the non-examined boss is somebody I don't want to work for. So I think it's important. Make this a regular discipline. How many of you, it's been maybe 2 or 3 years since you've attended training yourself? Okay. How many of you, it's been maybe 5 years? It's a long time. That's a long time. And you know, you need to keep your skills sharp, and your employees need that from you too. Page 127 is just a page I want to briefly point out to you. In terms of what my team out of St. Louis and all our world area corporate learning centers are responsible for, we're responsible for this focus 10%. And our offerings to you and to your employees focus in different areas like leadership skills, professional skills, business skills, HR and learning and development skills, and also some on-demand learning. Technical skills and things like selling skills will always be the responsibility of the business units, because every one of our business units may have a different go-to-market strategy. They have different technical skill requirements. The thing that we do have in common, though, across our businesses and our platform is how we manage and lead others. So that's why that's the responsibility of the team I lead and the other corporate learning centers. So you'll see on page 127 actually a detailed description of the workshops that we offer in each one of these categories. Many of our leadership skills courses, we've made the choice to keep them instructor-led versus online. And here's the rationale. The types of skills that my team and I provide you are high-touch skills. And I really believe that high-touch skills are best learned and practiced and mastered in a high-touch environment. That said, sometimes it's hard to wait, you know, and maybe you need something right here and right now in the moment. Beginning last week, we launched a pilot. If you'll direct your eyes toward the on-demand learning. Last week, we launched a pilot of 70 users at Emerson around the world using an online program called Harvard Managed Mentor. I've run the traps very carefully over the last several years to look at what we felt was the world's absolute best online learning in leadership development space, and we found it here. So we're running a deliberate 4-month pilot. We purchased 70 one-year licenses around the world. We've asked anyone who was part of that group that was selected to be very diligent and disciplined. And after 4 months, we're going to run some research on it, make some conclusions, and if it goes well, we will make this more available on a global level. It will also be in 4 languages, I think English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. So I've taken the programs myself. I'm very impressed. All the modules are taught by faculty of the Harvard Business School. There's great content. There's streaming videos, presentations, animations. You can download articles from Harvard Business Review. There's assessments, there's action plans, and there's also tools that you can download so that you can teach your direct report some of the things that you're learning as well. So we feel like this is really a pretty decent solution, but we'll really know at the end of the pilot. How many of you have seen our annual career development planning guide? Have you ever seen that before? There's actually a small stack of them still by the front door. Have you seen those before? It usually has the big words transform on the bottom of it. Our annual guide is at the print this week. It should be here in about a week and a half from now. And in this, which is now also globalized, it'll contain a detailed listing of every one of the things that are listed in your book here, so that you understand the purpose of the workshop, who should attend, how long the workshop is, what the business outcomes are, and what the learning objectives are, and also the leadership competencies that that program addresses. I want to give you some time to think and plan out your next steps. It's going to take you about 10 or 15 minutes to do. Page 128. Here's how I want you to answer that first question. Where do you want to be in your career 5 years from now? I want you to answer it in terms of where you want to be in your skill sets. Don't answer that first question based on a position, because that position may or may not be here. But chances are your skill sets are going to have to be different 5 years from now than they are today. So when you answer that first question, answer it based on the skill sets that you want to have 5 years from now. Some of you may want to be retired 5 years from now, and your skills will be golf or something, I don't know. But what I'd like you to do, please take about 12 to 15 minutes, and I want you to use this in your scheduled post-workshop briefing with your direct manager after this workshop. Probably within the next couple of weeks, you're going to give them that goal-setting template with the result, measurement, and date. One of the things that they need to create are some professional development goals. Could this be a good time not only to give them that template to write those professional development goals, but use this page as a way of helping them? If we aim at nothing, we'll always hit it. Well, I have an announcement. The instruction phase of our Leading at Emerson workshop is now over. You're not going to learn any more new skills in the rest of our time together. We've done that, and we've learned some good skills. At this point, we need to focus on how we're going to put them to work, back at work. So we're actually moving into the most important part of your training. These 3 days were inputs. Next 12 weeks will really tell us what these inputs have accomplished. The real work begins actually right now, so we're moving into the most important phase of our learning. Just to recap here, we've talked about this before. Leading at Emerson really isn't even a workshop, it's an operating system, and we're approaching this through a series of phases. We had the preparation phase, and for some of you, this was the first time you even went through a preparation phase. The first time you met with your manager over your career before you came to a course to understand the purpose of the workshop and why you were selected to attend, and the outcomes and the benefits and the expectations. We moved into the instruction phase, and what was different from this training to many others you've had is you spent 2/3 of the time here practicing. We had 15 activities yesterday, 15 activities the day before, we had 12 today. You spent about 2/3 of your time practicing and applying the skills rather than just seeing slides. This was the old finish line, but we're not anywhere near that yet. We are now into the implementation phase of our learning. So that said, I'd like to introduce to you that my executive sponsor for Leading at Emerson, some of you know him, it's Frank Dell'Aquila, Emerson's Chief Financial Officer. And he has about a 3.5-minute message for us. What I'm going to ask you to do is grab a pen, and I want you to write some things down, because about 3.5 minutes from now, I'm going to have you identify with the people at your table his message, and maybe the message behind the message as we hear him speak. I heard him say good luck. But I also heard him say that I expect you to have a post-workshop briefing with your direct manager. And I think your direct manager is probably in the one-day executive overview. And they know to have this meeting with you. So they know about this new finish line for learning. They also know about this video. And in fact, I don't remember whose boss it was. They said, how in the world did you get Frank to do this? Because he doesn't normally do this. I said, it was really interesting because first I asked him, after he shot the video, and Andy did it over in our studio here, Frank walked into my office. It was the morning before Thanksgiving. And Frank walks right into my office, and he made a very interesting comment. He said, we've moved the price tags. I thought that was an interesting conversation starter, but I knew what he was saying, but I said, help me track with you, what do you mean? He said, I realized before we talked about learning scrap and this new finish line for learning, and the old Leading at Emerson, these were his words, the only thing that we really valued was that people showed up, not that they did anything with it. He said, we've moved the price tags at Emerson, and we've taken it off something that really now I realize brought us no value, and we've put it on something that brings us real value. And then he said, as CFO, this is very valuable to me. This is valuable to Emerson. This is valuable to our shareholders. So the value ultimately is realized by what's going to be happening now as a result of 3 days of inputs. Because it's nice to have these flip charts and these job inventories, but what are we going to do? Page 132 is where we'll start as we enter this implementation phase. So again, 12 weeks from now, we'll be on a call or we'll meet back in this room for those of you who are located here. Each one of you, like Frank said, will take a couple minutes and just share, here's what I set out to accomplish, here's what I did accomplish, and here's the impact it's had on my team and I. But here's the catch. Over these 3 days, I could give you really a lot of knowledge and skill that you need to do your job and successfully manage and lead. However, when you go out the door in a few minutes, I have no guarantee that you're going to do a single thing. Unless when you get back to work, these things are in place for you. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that these 7 factors are in place for you? Your boss. And she and he knows that now. They've had that conversation. For you to have a successful transfer of this knowledge and skill part, this 10%, the next 12 weeks activates the 20 and 70, she or he knows that they need to have these things in place for you. Just like when you send your employees to my training, you're responsible for these things as well to reduce learning scrap and increase learning transfer. So let's begin on page 132. At the top, I've showed you this page before. You've written down a number of things. Hopefully you didn't equate any of them as New Year's resolutions. But now you begin to think about prioritizing them. And there's no formula, but considerations in the middle of 132. Low effort, high impact. Maybe it's high effort, high impact. I like this third one. Again, maybe you can secure an early win that builds momentum for you and your team. Some of your implementation decisions might be dependent on the amount of time it's going to take. Some of these you can work on today, this afternoon. Some of these might take some time. I want you to think through the proper sequencing of actions because, in some ways, why work on improving feedback if you don't have any standards? Bless you, everyone's sneezing at once here. So think through the proper sequencing. I want to guide you through some thoughtful exercises here, beginning with question number 1. Before we get any further, what I'd like you to do is write your own finish line statement right now. And I'd like you to complete the sentence that said, this investment, in my professional development will be a success when you fill in the blank. Once everybody at your table is filling in that blank, share your success statement with everybody else, and then I'll bring it up to the front of the group again and facilitate some more work. View your action plan entries. You have 2 pages, you've got 7 boxes, if not more along the way. I'd like you to prioritize them using that kind of filter of considerations that are in the middle of page 142. Again, low effort, high impact, early wins, however you want to do it. I'd like you to write them in the space provided on 133. And then begin to prepare, at least conceptually, for your post-workshop briefing, which you're probably going to have with your boss within the next week or so. They know to have this meeting. They know how to have this meeting. They understand the new finish line. They've all seen Frank's message as well. And they all want to reduce learning scrap too. Okay? So take some time here. Let's take about 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll begin to wrap things up, okay? So this was built around 4 outcomes. The only way that we're going to see 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these is if some deliberate focus work is put toward this over the next few weeks. But I just don't want to launch you and leave you. I'm more of a fan of launch you and love you. So I want to make an offer to you. I'd like to earn the right to be your implementation phase coach, if I can. You remember that definition of a coach? It's what? A vehicle that... Yeah, so who are these important people we're talking about? That's you. Of course it's you. So I'd like to be your learning transfer, your implementation phase coach. So here's what I want to offer you. First, I want to offer you free, unlimited telephone or WebEx or drop-in consultations in person. Some of you, you're right across the sidewalk from me. So if I'm in town, just schedule some quick time with me. And I'd like to meet with you and and be your coach and encourage you. So I also want to offer you a free and a confidential review service. What's that about? Maybe you're working on some job inventories and you'd like to run it past another set of eyes and somebody who knows something about job inventories. Send them to me and I'll review them and I'll give you feedback. You have my confidence. If you send them to me, no one else will see it. I won't use it in next month's workshop as a bad example of a job inventory or anything like that, okay? No, I'll give you feedback as well about what you've done well, but I can give you coaching. I can certainly listen to you and I can ask you some questions and kind of help coach you along the way to really reduce that learning scrap and increase learning transfer, okay? So please take advantage of that. So I think you've already gotten the invitation from Erica. Now, one or two of you have already come to me and saying, I'm going to be out of the country. Don't fret yourself that way. Just contact Erica because once every month we have a makeup capstone call. It's not cohort specific, so you'll be kind of in an all-comers thing of other people from other leading at Emerson's because we typically run 2, sometimes 3 leading at Emerson's a week somewhere around North America right now. 4 outcomes. This is exciting. So the real work begins right now, gang. I hope that this was a worthwhile investment for you, and we're at your service going forward. That said, you're free to go. We'll see you in 12 weeks or sooner. Thank you, everybody.